Ara's feet barely touched the stone steps as she fled. The ceremony hall still glowed behind her, candles flickering through tall windows, voices rising in the mating song she should have answered. She hadn't. Instead, she'd slipped through the side door while the elder raised the ceremonial cup, while every eye turned toward the dais where her alpha was meant to claim her. She ran. The forest opened before her like a held breath. Dawn light filtered through pine and oak, soft and gray, and the cool air bit at her throat as she pushed deeper into the trees. Her ceremonial gown caught on low branches. She didn't stop to free it. The silk tore. She kept moving. Her hand pressed against her left shoulder, fingers tight over the hidden mark. It burned beneath her palm, not with pain, with presence, with knowing. The bite had come 3 nights ago, delivered in darkness while she slept, and when she woke, the bond had already begun to hum beneath her skin. She'd felt him before she ever saw his face, felt his calm, his certainty, his quiet, unshakable claim. It terrified her. She'd covered the mark with powder and high collars. She'd smiled through the preparation rituals, nodded when the elder women blessed her, and said nothing when they dressed her in white and gold. But when the moment came to step forward and meet his eyes across the hall, her body had moved without permission, toward the door, toward the forest, toward anything but surrender. If stories like this one draw you in, please subscribe so you never miss another. Ara stumbled over a root and caught herself against a birch tree, breathing hard. Her hair had come loose from its braids. Dark waves fell across her face, and she pushed them back with shaking hands. She was small-boned and quick, built for speed rather than strength, and she'd always trusted her legs to carry her farther than anyone expected. But the bond didn't care how fast she ran. It pulled, not with force, with longing. A thread tied somewhere deep in her chest, stretching thinner with every step but never breaking. She could feel him on the other end of it, steady, patient, waiting. She pressed her back against the tree and closed her eyes. Her mother had worn that same look, that emptiness, the hollow smile of a woman who'd been claimed and never chosen, who'd spent 20 years standing beside a mate she didn't love and couldn't leave. Ara had watched her fade, year by year, until nothing remained but obedience and silence. She would not become that. The forest stretched quiet around her. Birds called in the canopy. Somewhere distant, water ran over stone. She drew a slow breath and opened her eyes, scanning the trees for the path that would take her north, toward the border, toward the unclaimed lands where no alpha's reach could follow. Then she heard the footsteps, soft, deliberate, not hurried. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. She pushed off the tree and turned, her eyes searching the shadows between the cur's trunks. The footsteps came closer, one set, measured and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world, as though he'd known exactly where she would run. Ara's throat tightened. She took a step back, then another, her bare feet silent on the moss. The river wasn't far. If she could reach it, cross it, she might still. He stepped into view. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving through the dappled light like he belonged to it. His dark hair was tied back, and his eyes, steady and storm gray, found hers without hesitation. He wore no ceremonial robes, just a simple tunic and worn boots, as though he'd walked out of the hall and into the woods without a second thought. Veyron, the Alpha King, her mate. He stopped 10 paces away and said nothing, just looked at her. His gaze traveled over her torn gown, her loose hair, the way her hand still pressed against her shoulder. Then his eyes lifted back to hers and something softened in his expression. Not anger, Not command, just knowing. Ara's breath came shallow and fast. She wanted to run again, wanted to bolt for the river and let the current carry her somewhere he couldn't follow. But her legs wouldn't move. The bond hummed between them, warmer now, insistent, and she hated how much her body wanted to step closer. He tilted his head slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was low and careful. Ara. Just her name. Nothing more. She swallowed hard. Her fingers curled tighter against the mark, and she saw his gaze flicker there, just for a moment. He knew. Of course he knew. He'd been the one to leave it. "Why did you run?" he asked quietly. The question landed soft, without accusation, and somehow that made it worse. She'd expected fury, demands, the crushing weight of an alpha's will. Instead he stood there, patient and still, waiting for an answer she didn't know how to give. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I didn't choose this." "I know." 2 words. Calm, certain. She stared at him. "Then why did you mark me?" Veyron's jaw tightened, just slightly, and he looked away for the first time. His gaze moved to the trees, to the light breaking through the branches, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something she hadn't expected. Regret. "Because the bond chose for both of us," he said, "and I was afraid if I waited, you'd disappear before I ever had the chance to know you." Ara's chest ached. She wanted to argue, wanted to throw his words back at him and demand why his fear mattered more than hers. But the way he stood there, shoulders tight, eyes distant, he looked less like a king and more like a man who'd gambled everything and lost. "I won't force you," he said, turning back to face her. "I should have said that first. I won't force you to stay. I won't use the bond to bind you. If you want to walk away, I'll let you." Her breath caught. "I'll what?" she whispered. "Let you go." He took a single step closer, slow and careful, and his eyes never left hers. "The mark can be broken. It's rare, painful, but it can be done. If that's what you want, I'll find a way." Ara's hand fell away from her shoulder. She stared at him, searching his face for the lie, for the trap, for the cruel edge that had to be hiding somewhere beneath the calm. She found nothing but truth. "Why?" she asked, and her voice came out small. "Why would you offer that?" Veyron's mouth curved, just slightly, into something too sad to be called a smile. "Because I don't want a mate who's running," he said softly. "I want one who stays." The forest held its breath around them. Ara felt the bond pull again, warmer now, aching, and for the first time since she'd woken, with the mark burning on her skin, she didn't flinch away from it. She didn't step closer either, not yet. But she didn't run either. The river whispered somewhere behind her. The morning birds had fallen silent, as though they too were waiting to see what she would choose. Ara's pulse hammered in her throat, and the bond thrummed steady and insistent beneath her ribs, pulling her toward the man who stood so carefully still. Veyron hadn't moved. He simply watched her, his gray eyes patient, his hands loose at his sides. There was no command in his posture, no expectation, just presence, the kind that filled a space without demanding it. She hated how steady he was, hated that he could stand there offering her freedom while she trembled like a leaf about to fall. "You marked me without asking," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended. "You tied me to you while I slept, and now you tell me I can leave?" "Yes." One word. No defense, no excuse. Ara's hands curled into fists at her sides. "That doesn't make it right." "No," Veyron said quietly. "It doesn't." The admission caught her off guard. She'd expected him to justify it. to explain pack law or fate or the inevitability of the bond. Instead, he simply stood there and acknowledged the harm. "I was wrong," he continued, his voice low and even. "I told myself the bond was enough, that it would be kinder to secure it before you had time to fear it. But I was afraid, Ara. Afraid you'd run before I ever had the chance to prove I wasn't what you feared." "And what do I fear?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Veyron's gaze didn't waver. "That I'll take everything you are and leave nothing behind." The words hit like a fist to the chest. She looked away, blinking hard against the sting in her eyes. He'd named it. The thing she hadn't been able to say out loud, even to herself. Her mother's face rose in her memory. That distant smile. Those empty eyes. "My mother was bonded," Ara said, and her voice came out rough. "To an alpha who never asked what she wanted. He wasn't cruel. He didn't hit her. He just existed. And she disappeared inside that existence until there was nothing left of who she'd been." She looked back at Veyron and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't name. Not pity, something deeper, something that ached. "I won't be her," Ara whispered. "I won't spend my life standing in someone else's shadow, silent and small and grateful just to be kept." "I know." Veyron's voice was barely more than a breath. "I've seen it too. The bonds that break people instead of binding them. The mates who forget that love is supposed to be a choice, not a cage." He took another step closer, and this time Ara didn't retreat. The bond hummed warmer between them, and she felt the edge of his presence brush against hers. Careful, questioning, offering, rather than taking. "I don't want to own you, Ara," he said softly. "I don't want a mate who obeys without question or follows without thought. I want—" He paused, his jaw working as though the words cost him something. "I want someone who stands beside me because she chooses to, not because fate or bond or duty demanded it." Ara's breath came shallow, her heart beat hard and unsteady, and she couldn't tell anymore if it was fear or something else entirely. "Then why mark me at all?" she asked. "If you wanted choice, why take it away?" Veyron's expression shifted. For the first time since he'd stepped into the clearing, she saw something other than calm in his eyes. Regret, yes, but beneath it, loneliness. The kind that ran deep and quiet, the kind a man learned to carry without complaint. "Because I'm a coward," he said simply. "I felt the bond the moment I saw you. It wasn't just recognition, it was certainty. Like every missing piece I'd carried finally found its place. And I was terrified you wouldn't feel the same, that you'd look at me and see only duty, only burden." He exhaled slowly, and his shoulders dropped just slightly, as though confessing had taken weight he'd been holding too long. "So I marked you while you slept," he continued. "Told myself it was tradition. Told myself you'd understand once the bond settled. But the truth is, I was afraid to give you the chance to say no." Ara's throat tightened. She wanted to be angry. Wanted to hold on to the fury that had carried her out of the hall and into the forest. But standing here, watching the way he held himself so carefully together, she found the anger slipping through her fingers like water. "That's not fair," she said quietly. "You can't just admit everything and expect me to forgive it." Veyron's mouth curved again, that same sad, almost smile. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance." "A chance to what?" "To prove the bond didn't steal your choice. To show you that staying doesn't mean disappearing." He took one more step, close enough now that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the faint scar that traced his jawline. "Stay for 1 week. No ceremony. No claim. Just time. Let me show you who I am when I'm not trying to be a king. And if at the end of it you still want to leave, I'll break the bond myself. Aura's pulse hammered in her ears. The offer hung between them, fragile and impossible. Every instinct she had screamed at her to refuse. To run while she still could, before the bond sank deeper and took root in places she couldn't cut away. But another part of her, quieter, steadier, whispered a different truth. She'd fled the ceremony. She'd run through the forest with her heart in her throat and her future burning on her shoulder. And he'd followed. Not with demands. Not with force. Just with honesty and the kind of patience she'd never expected from an alpha. He'd offered her freedom. Real freedom. The kind that came with pain and cost and the breaking of something sacred. And he'd done it without hesitation. Aura drew a slow breath and felt the bond hum soft and waiting beneath her ribs. It didn't pull now. Didn't insist. It simply existed. A thread between them that neither had asked for but both had received. She met Veyron's eyes and saw him brace, as though preparing for the blow of her refusal. 1 week, she said quietly. His breath caught. Hope flickered across his face, raw and unguarded, and he caught it before it could settle. 1 week, he repeated. And at the end, you choose. I choose, Aura agreed. The bond warmed between them, not with command, but with something softer, something that felt almost like relief. Veyron held out his hand, palm up, and waited. Aura looked at it, at the calluses on his fingers, at the strength held so carefully in check. She thought of her mother's empty smile, of the life she'd sworn never to live, of all the reasons she'd run and all the fears she still carried. Then she thought of the way he'd stood in the forest and offered her freedom, even though it would cost him everything. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and steady, and he didn't pull her closer, just held on, as though that single point of contact was enough. Thank you, he said softly. Aura's throat tightened. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Veyron's thumb brushed once across her knuckles, a gesture so small and careful it made her chest ache. Then he stepped back, releasing her hand, and gestured toward the trees. My cabin's north of here, he said. It's quiet, private. No one will disturb us. Aura hesitated, then nodded again. All right. He waited for her to move first, and when she did, he fell into step beside her. Not ahead, not behind. Just beside. The bond hummed soft and steady between them as they walked deeper into the forest, and for the first time since she'd woken with the mark burning on her skin, Aura didn't feel like she was running. She felt like she was choosing. The cabin emerged from the trees like a secret kept too long. Aura stopped at the edge of the clearing, her breath catching. She'd expected something grand. Stone walls and carved posts, the kind of structure that announced power and dominion. Instead, she found a low wooden structure with moss growing on the north-facing roof and wildflowers clustered beneath the windows. It looked lived in, loved. Veyron moved past her without comment, his boots soft on the worn path. He pushed open the door and stepped aside, waiting. Not commanding, just offering. Aura's fingers curled at her sides. The bond hummed warmer now, not pulling but present, like a low note held steady beneath her ribs. She drew a breath and crossed the threshold. The interior smelled of cedar and smoke. A stone hearth dominated one wall, ashes still warm from a recent fire. Simple furniture filled the space. A table with 2 chairs, a low couch draped with woven blankets, shelves lined with books whose spines had cracked from use. Everything spoke of solitude chosen rather than imposed. "It's not much," Veyron said quietly behind her, "but it's mine. No council, no court, just quiet." Ara turned to look at him. He stood in the doorway still, backlit by morning sun, and for the first time she saw him without the weight of ceremony pressing down. His shoulders had eased, his jaw had loosened. He looked younger somehow, more human. "You come here often?" she asked. "When I can." He stepped inside and closed the door with care. When being king becomes too heavy to carry without breaking. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She'd expected walls. Expected him to hold himself apart, untouchable and certain. Instead, he moved to the hearth and knelt to coax the embers back to life, his hands steady and familiar with the work. Ara watched the way firelight caught on his profile, the strong line of his nose, the shadow of exhaustion beneath his eyes. He hadn't slept, she realized. He'd stayed awake through the ceremony, through her flight, through the long walk to the river, and now here. "You should rest," she said quietly. Veyron glanced up, surprise flickering across his face. Then his mouth curved, just slightly. "So should you." "I'm too." She paused, searching for the word. "Too wound up." "I know the feeling." He rose and gestured toward the couch. "Sit, please. I'll make tea." Ara hesitated, then moved to the couch and lowered herself onto the cushions. They were softer than she expected, worn in and comfortable. She watched Veyron move through the small kitchen space, his movements efficient and unhurried. He filled a kettle from a pitcher, set it on a hook above the growing fire, and reached for a wooden box on the shelf. "You don't have servants here," she said. It wasn't a question. "No." He measured dried leaves into 2 clay cups. "I come here to remember what it feels like to be just myself, not a king, not an alpha, just Veyron." The name hung in the air between them. She'd heard it spoken 100 times in the week leading up to the ceremony, always with reverence or formality. But the way he said it now, quiet and unadorned, made it sound like something fragile, something he didn't share often. Ara drew her knees up onto the couch and wrapped her arms around them. The torn silk of her ceremonial gown bunched awkwardly, and she grimaced at the muddy hem. "I must look ridiculous," she murmured. Veyron turned, kettle in hand, and his eyes swept over her. Not with judgment, with something softer. "You look like someone who ran toward freedom instead of away from fear," he said. "There's nothing ridiculous in that." Her throat tightened. She looked away, focusing on the fire, and felt the weight of his gaze linger a moment longer before he turned back to the tea. The kettle began to steam. Veyron poured water into both cups and brought them to the low table in front of the couch. He handed one to Ara, his fingers careful not to brush hers, and settled into the chair across from her. They sat in silence while the tea steeped. The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the pines, a sound so constant and quiet, it felt like breathing. Ara took a sip and tasted mint and something earthy she couldn't name. It warmed her from the inside, loosening the knot that had lived in her chest since the mark first burned to life. "Tell me why you're afraid," Veyron said quietly. She lowered the cup and met his eyes. "You already know. I know what you said at the river, but I want to understand." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, his gaze steady and patient. "Tell me about your mother." Ara's first instinct was to refuse, to hold that pain close where no one else could see it. But something in the way he asked, not demanding, just listening, made the words rise anyway. "She was beautiful," Ara said softly. Everyone said so. Bright and quick and full of laughter. And then she was bonded to my father. And all of that dimmed, year by year, until she became a shadow who smiled when expected and spoke only to agree. Veyron's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or grief. He wasn't cruel, Ara continued. He provided, protected, did everything an alpha is supposed to do. But he never asked what she wanted, never wondered if she was happy. He just assumed the bond was enough. And it wasn't, Veyron said quietly. No. Ara's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and forced herself to continue. She used to sing. Before, I barely remember it. I was so young, but I remember her voice filling the house, bright and wild. After the bond settled, she never sang again. The silence that followed felt heavy, not uncomfortable, just full. Veyron set his cup down and leaned back, his gaze distant. My father was the same, not to my mother. She died when I was young. But to the pack, to everyone who looked to him for guidance. He believed strength meant certainty, that a true alpha never questioned, never doubted, never bent. He paused, his jaw tightening. It made him a terrible king, and a worse father. Ara's chest ached. She watched the firelight play across his features and saw the weight he carried, not just of crown and duty, but of memory, of lessons learned too hard and held too close. I swore I wouldn't be him, Veyron said softly, that if I ever found my mate, I would ask instead of assume, listen instead of command. His eyes lifted to hers, and the rawness in them stole her breath. But when the bond snapped into place and I felt you on the other end of it, all that certainty crumbled. I was so afraid you'd look at me and see only another alpha who would cage you. So I marked you in the dark and told myself it was fate, not choice. But it was choice, Ara whispered. Yours, not mine. Yes. He didn't look away, didn't soften the admission. And I'm sorry for that, Ara. More than I know how to say. She believed him. That was the worst part, the most confusing part. She believed the regret in his voice, the pain in his eyes, the way his hands curled tight against his knees, as though holding himself back from reaching for her. I don't know how to do this, she said, and her voice came out small. I don't know how to trust a bond I didn't choose, or a mate I didn't pick. Neither do I, Veyron said, but I'm willing to learn, if you'll let me. The bond hummed soft between them, and for the first time Ara let herself truly feel it. Not as a chain or a claim, but as a question waiting for an answer. She set her cup down and met his eyes across the firelight. Then teach me, she said quietly. Show me who you are when no one's watching, when you're not trying to be strong or certain or right. Show me the parts you hide. Veyron's breath left him in a rush. Relief and something deeper flickered across his face, and he nodded once. I will, he promised. All of it. The fire had burned lower by the time Veyron rose from his chair. Ara watched him move to the kitchen, her body still curled on the couch, the empty teacup warm between her palms. He didn't ask if she was hungry. He simply began pulling things from the shelves. Bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of preserved fruit, cheese that smelled sharp and earthy. You don't have to, she started. I know. He glanced over his shoulder, and something in his expression stopped her protest. Not command, just care. But I'm going to anyway. Ara fell silent. She watched him work, his movements efficient and practiced. He sliced the bread with steady hands, arranged everything on a wooden board, and brought it to the table. Then he returned to the kitchen and began chopping vegetables she hadn't noticed him pull from a basket. "You cook," she said, and it came out more surprised than she intended. Veyron's mouth curved. "I do. Most alphas don't. Most alphas have staff to do it for them." He swept the chopped carrots into a pot hanging over the fire. "I prefer to remember what it feels like to take care of myself." Ara uncurled from the couch and moved to the table. She picked up a piece of bread and bit into it, the crust crackling between her teeth. It tasted of salt and honey, simple and good. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite settled in her stomach. Veyron added herbs to the pot, stirring slowly, and the cabin filled with the scent of rosemary and thyme. He moved with the kind of ease that came from repetition, from choosing this solitude often enough that it had become routine. "How often do you come here?" she asked. "Once a month, if I can manage it." He tasted the broth and added a pinch of salt. "Sometimes more if the council is particularly insufferable." A surprised laugh escaped her. Veyron looked up, his eyes brightening, and she realized it was the first time she'd laughed since the mark appeared. "They are, then?" she asked. "Insufferable?" Profoundly. He ladled soup into 2 bowls and brought them to the table, settling into the chair across from her. "They mean well. Most of them. But they're so caught up in tradition and protocol that they forget what any of it's for." Ara lifted her spoon and blew on the broth. "And what is it for?" "Taking care of people." Veyron's voice softened. "Making sure everyone has what they need to live well, to feel safe. The ceremony, the laws, the hierarchy, it's all supposed to serve that. But somewhere along the way, it became the point instead of the path." She took a sip. The soup was rich and savory, warming her all the way down. "You sound like you don't believe in it." "I believe in taking care of people," he said. "The rest, I'm less certain about." Ara studied him across the table. The firelight played over his features, softening the lines around his eyes, and she saw exhaustion there again. Not just from the sleepless night, from years of carrying weight he hadn't chosen. "Why did you become king?" she asked quietly. Veyron was silent for a long moment. He ate slowly, his gaze distant, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something heavy. "Because my father died, and I was the only heir." He set his spoon down. "I was 23. I knew nothing about ruling, nothing about leading. I'd spent most of my life trying not to become him, and suddenly I was expected to fill the space he'd left. That must have been terrifying." It was. He met her eyes, and the honesty there made her chest ache. "I made mistakes. So many mistakes. I listened to the wrong people, ignored my instincts, tried to be the king I thought everyone needed instead of the one I actually was." "And now?" Ara asked. "Now I'm still figuring it out." A faint smile touched his mouth. "But at least I've stopped pretending I have all the answers." She felt the bond hum between them, warmer now, and realized it wasn't pulling her toward anything. It was simply there, a presence that matched his. Steady, patient, undemanding. "Tell me about the mark," she said quietly. "How it happened." Veyron's expression shifted. The ease that had settled over him during their meal tightened, and he looked away toward the fire. "You were asleep," he said. "In the guest chamber the council prepared for you. I'd felt the bond snap into place the moment you arrived, but I hadn't approached you yet, hadn't introduced myself. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, but the truth is, I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of you seeing me and feeling nothing." His voice dropped lower. The bond doesn't guarantee love, Ara. It guarantees connection, recognition, but not love. I'd watched too many bonded pairs live beside each other like strangers, tied by fate, but separated by everything that mattered. Ara's throat tightened. She'd seen it too. Her parents. Half the mated pairs in her old pack. Bound but not joined. So I came to your room, Veyron continued. Told myself I just wanted to see you. To be near you for a moment, before the ceremony made everything official. But when I saw you there, sleeping so peacefully, I felt the bond surge and I just... He exhaled slowly. I marked you. Gently, carefully. Told myself you'd barely feel it. That when you woke, it would already be done and you wouldn't have to be afraid. But I was afraid, Ara said softly. I woke up claimed without ever being asked. I know. He turned back to face her, and the regret in his eyes was so raw it hurt to look at. I thought I was protecting you from the uncertainty, but I was really just protecting myself from rejection. The fire crackled between them. Ara's hand drifted to her shoulder, fingers brushing the hidden mark, and she felt it pulse warm beneath her touch. Does it hurt you? She asked. The bond. When I ran. Did it hurt? Veyron hesitated, then nodded once. Yes, not physically. But I felt you pull away. Felt your fear. Your anger. It was like watching something precious slip through my fingers and knowing I'd been the one to let go. Ara's chest ached. She'd expected him to hide that, to maintain the alpha's mask of strength and control. Instead, he sat across from her and admitted the pain without flinching. I don't know if I can trust it, she said quietly. The bond. Even if I learn to trust you, how do I know what I'm feeling is real? How do I know I'm choosing you and not just obeying something written into my blood? I don't know, Veyron said, and his honesty hit her like a blow. I've asked myself the same thing, whether what I feel for you is real or just the bond telling me what to feel. And I think maybe it doesn't matter. He leaned forward, his eyes holding hers. Because even if the bond gave us the connection, we still choose what to do with it. We still choose whether to build something or let it remain empty. The bond can't make me patient, can't make me listen, can't make me see you as anything other than fate's gift. Those are choices I make, every day, every moment. Ara's breath came shallow. The bond thrummed between them, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a chain. It felt like a doorway, one she could walk through or turn away from. Show me, she said quietly. Show me the parts you're afraid to let anyone see. Veyron's throat worked. He stood slowly and moved around the table, not toward her, but toward the far wall. He pulled his tunic over his head in one smooth motion, and Ara's breath caught. Scars, old ones and new. They traced across his back and shoulders in pale lines, some thin and surgical, others jagged and brutal. He turned to face her, and more marked his chest, a deep one over his ribs, another across his collarbone. These are from the challenges, he said quietly. Every alpha who wanted my crown, every fight I barely survived. The council covers them with formal robes during ceremonies. They say a king should look unmarked, untouchable. He met her eyes, and the vulnerability there stole her breath. But this is what I am, he said. Scarred, tired, doing my best and failing more often than I succeed. Ara rose from the table, She crossed to him slowly, her heart hammering, and stopped just close enough to see the silver lines that mapped his skin. Her hand lifted without permission, hovering near the scar over his heart. "May I?" she whispered. Veyron nodded, and she touched him. Just her fingertips against the raised tissue, feeling the proof of survival written into his body. "You're not what I expected," she said softly. "Neither are you." His voice came rough. "I thought you'd be easier, simpler, someone who'd accept the bond without question. But you're so much more than that, Ara. You're brave and angry and honest, and I don't deserve you. But I want to try." She looked up and found him watching her with an expression that made her chest ache. Not possession, not command, just hope. Fragile and careful. Ara let her hand fall away and stepped back. The bond hummed warm between them, patient and waiting. "1 week," she said quietly. "Show me more." Veyron exhaled, and relief softened every line of his body. "I will," he promised. "Everything." The days unfolded quietly, like pages turned with care. Morning came soft through the cabin windows, light filtering through pine branches to pool on the wooden floor. Ara woke on the second day to the smell of bread baking and found Veyron already awake, his hands dusted with flour, his hair falling loose around his shoulders. He looked up when she emerged from the small bedroom he'd given her. "Good morning," he said, and his voice carried no expectation. "Just welcome." She moved to the table and sat, watching him work. His movements were practiced and calm, shaping dough with steady hands. There was something meditative in the way he moved, as though this simple task anchored him. "You didn't sleep much," she observed. "Old habit." He slid the loaf into the stone oven built into the hearth. "Kings don't rest easy." "You're not king here," Ara said quietly. Veyron paused, his back still to her, and she saw his shoulders drop slightly. When he turned, something in his expression had softened. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence. Fresh bread with honey, berries he'd picked at dawn, tea that tasted of chamomile, and peace. Ara found herself watching him between bites, noting the way firelight caught on the silver threading through his dark hair, the quiet strength in his hands, the way he listened to the forest sounds outside as though reading a familiar text. "Tell me something no one else knows," she said suddenly. Veyron's eyes lifted to hers, surprise flickering across his face. Then he set down his cup and leaned back, considering. "I wanted to be a healer," he said finally. "Before my father died, before the crown, I used to slip away to the pack physician's workshop and watch him set bones, mix medicines, tend wounds. I thought, if I could learn to mend things, maybe I could fix what was broken in my family." Ara's chest tightened. "Did you?" "No." His mouth curved sadly. "My father found out. Told me healing was beneath an alpha. That strength came from dominance, not care. He forbade me from returning. But you went back anyway." Veyron's eyes brightened with something like wonder. "How did you know?" "Because you're here." She gestured to the cabin, to the quiet life he'd built in secret. "Because you chose this when you could have chosen anything." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried weight. "You see me," he said softly. "Not the king, not the alpha, just me." "Yes," Ara whispered. The bond hummed between them, warmer than before, and she felt something shift. Not possession, not command, just recognition, the kind that ran deeper than fate. The third day brought rain. It drummed against the roof, and ran down the windows in silver threads, turning the world beyond the glass into watercolor. Veyron built up the fire while Ara curled on the couch with one of his books, and they spent the morning in quiet companionship. He carved at the table, his knife moving in small, precise strokes, shaping wood into something she couldn't yet name. She watched him between pages, noting the concentration in his face, the way his hands moved with complete certainty. "What are you making?" she asked finally. He held up the piece. "A bird, small and delicate, its wings half spread as though caught mid-flight." "For you," he said, "if you want it." Ara's throat tightened. She set the book aside and crossed to the table, taking the carving carefully in her palm. The wood was warm and smooth, every feather etched with care. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You said you felt caged." Veyron's voice came quiet. "I wanted you to have something that reminded you flight is still possible." Tears pricked at her eyes. She closed her fingers around the bird and looked up to find him watching her with an expression that made her heart ache. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, then returned to his carving, and Ara stood there holding the wooden bird, feeling the bond pulse warm and steady beneath her ribs. By the fourth evening, they'd fallen into rhythm. He cooked while she read aloud from his books, her voice filling the cabin with stories of distant lands and impossible magic. He listened while he worked, his hands steady on knife and pot, and sometimes he'd stop to ask her to repeat a passage, not because he hadn't heard, but because he wanted to hear it again. They ate together by firelight, talked about small things and large ones. He told her about the weight of council meetings and the loneliness of decisions made alone. She told him about her mother's garden, the one place her light had never fully dimmed, and how Ara still remembered the names of every flower. "Lavender for peace," she said softly. "Roses for love, sage for wisdom." "What did she plant most?" Veyron asked. Ara's voice caught. "Forget-me-nots." He reached across the table and took her hand. Just held it, his thumb brushing gentle across her knuckles, and didn't ask her to explain. The touch said everything words couldn't. That night, after the dishes were washed and the fire banked low, Veyron paused at the door to his own room. "Ara," he said quietly. She looked up from the couch where she'd been preparing to sleep. "I need you to know something." He stood very still, his hand on the doorframe, his eyes steady on hers. "This week, it's not a test. It's not me trying to prove you should stay or convince you the bond is right. It's just time for both of us to be honest." "I know," she said, "and I need you to know that if you choose to leave," his voice roughened, "I'll keep my promise, no matter how much it costs." Ara's heart twisted. She rose from the couch and crossed the small space between them, stopping just close enough to see the firelight reflected in his eyes. "I know that too," she whispered. Veyron's hand lifted, hovering near her face, and she saw him stop himself, saw him choose restraint over impulse. The bond thrummed between them, patient and waiting, and she realized he'd been holding himself back all week. Never touching unless she initiated, never pressing closer unless she invited it. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his chest, just for a moment, and felt his breath catch. His arms came around her carefully, not possessive, not claiming, just holding. And Ara let herself be held, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, the warmth of him surrounding her like shelter. When she finally stepped back, his eyes were bright. "Good night, Ara," he said softly. "Good night." On the fifth morning, Ara woke before dawn. She rose quietly and moved to the main room, drawn by sound. Veyron stood at the window, his back to her, his shoulders tight with some weight he hadn't set down. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly. He turned, and in the pre-dawn light she saw exhaustion etched deep in his face. not from lack of rest, from something older, heavier. I keep thinking about what happens when the week ends, he admitted, and I'm afraid. Ara crossed to him slowly. Of what? That I've failed. His voice came rough. That you'll look back on these days and see nothing worth staying for. That the bond will break and I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I had something precious and couldn't hold it. You're not holding it, Ara said quietly. You're offering it. Veyron's eyes closed. It doesn't feel like enough. She reached up and touched his face, her palm against his cheek, and felt him lean into her hand like a man starving for touch. You told me the bond didn't steal my choice, she whispered. You said it revealed someone I could choose freely. His eyes opened, hope and fear warring in their depths. I'm starting to believe you, she said. Veyron's breath left him in a rush. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his face, and his voice, when it came, was barely more than breath. Ara. Not yet, she said gently, but soon. Ask me soon? Dawn broke beyond the window, spilling gold across the cabin floor, and the bond hummed warm between them, like a promise waiting to be spoken. The 6th morning arrived, wrapped in mist. Ara woke to gray light filtering through the windows and the sound of Veyron moving quietly in the main room. She lay still for a moment, her hand drifting to the mark on her shoulder, feeling it pulse warm and steady beneath her fingertips. The week was ending. Tonight would be her last night in the cabin, the final hours before she had to choose. She rose and dressed slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she laced her borrowed tunic. Veyron had given her clothes that fit better than the torn ceremonial gown, simple things that smelled of cedar and soap and him. When she emerged, she found him at the table, 2 cups of tea already poured, his eyes shadowed but calm. Last day, he said quietly. Yes. They sat together in silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down between them. Ara wrapped her hands around the warm cup and watched steam rise and dissipate in the morning air. I don't want to lose this, she said finally, and her voice came out smaller than she intended. These days, this peace, I've never felt anything like it. Veyron's eyes lifted to hers. Neither have I, but I'm still afraid. The admission hurt coming out. I'm afraid that the moment we leave this cabin, everything will change. That you'll become the king again, and I'll become the mate everyone expects me to be. And all of this, all the honesty and quiet, will disappear. It won't, Veyron said, and there was such certainty in his voice it made her chest ache. Not if we don't let it. You can't promise that. No. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his gaze holding hers. But I can promise to keep choosing this. Choosing honesty. Choosing to see you instead of just the bond. Every day. Every moment. Ara's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself fall into the warmth she'd found here and trust it would hold. Ask me, she whispered. Veyron went very still. Ara, you said you'd ask, at the end of the week. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Ask me now. He rose slowly and moved around the table, stopping in front of her. His hand lifted, hovering near her face, and this time when she leaned into his touch, he didn't pull away. Stay with me, he said quietly. Not because fate demands it, not because the bond pulls you. Stay because you choose to. Because these days have meant something to you. Because you want to see what we could build together if we're both willing to try. Tears pricked at Ara's eyes. She covered his hand with hers, pressing his palm more firmly against her cheek. I'm afraid, she whispered. So am I. What if I lose myself? Then I'll remind you who you are. Every day, every time you forget. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, catching a tear before it could fall. I won't let you disappear, Ara. I promise you that. She looked up into his eyes and saw everything she'd been afraid to hope for. Patience, devotion, the kind of steady strength that came from choosing gentleness over power. Yes, she breathed. Veyron's eyes widened. Yes, yes, I'll stay. I choose you. I choose this. His breath left him in a rush. Relief and wonder, and something deeper flooded his expression. And then he was pulling her up from the chair, his arms coming around her, holding her close against his chest. Ara buried her face against his shoulder and felt the bond surge warm between them. Not commanding, not claiming, just complete, as though some missing piece had finally locked into place. Thank you, Veyron whispered against her hair. Thank you. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, the morning light spilling gold across the cabin floor around them. When Ara finally pulled back far enough to see his face, she found tears tracking down his cheeks. She reached up and brushed them away, and Veyron caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Complete it, she said softly. The bond. Finish what you started. His eyes searched hers. Are you certain? Yes. And she was. The fear was still there, humming quiet beneath her ribs. But it was no longer the only thing she felt. Trust lived there too now. And hope. And the beginning of something that might, in time, become love. Veyron drew her closer, his hand sliding up to cup the back of her neck. His eyes held hers, asking permission one last time, and when she nodded, he leaned down and pressed his mouth to the mark on her shoulder. The bond flared bright and hot between them. Ara gasped, her hands fisting in his tunic, and felt something snap into place deep in her chest. The connection that had been pulling at her all week suddenly settled, no longer insistent but simply there, present and permanent and chosen. Veyron's arms tightened around her, and she felt him tremble. I feel you, he whispered against her skin. Everything you are. It's beautiful, Ara. You're beautiful. She turned her face into his neck and breathed him in. Cedar and smoke and something uniquely him, something the bond now recognized as home. I feel you too, she said quietly, and I'm not afraid anymore. They stood together as the bond settled into permanence, two people who had chosen each other despite fear, despite fate, despite everything that had tried to make the choice for them. When Veyron finally pulled back, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. What happens now? He asked. Ara smiled, small and trembling, but real. Now we figure it out. Together. He cupped her face in both hands and kissed her. Not with demand or possession, but with gratitude and wonder, and the kind of tenderness that came from seeing someone fully and choosing them anyway. Ara kissed him back, her hands sliding up to tangle in his hair, and let herself fall into the warmth between them. When they finally broke apart, breathless and steady, Veyron rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said quietly. I know it's too soon. I know the bond makes it complicated, but I need you to know what I feel isn't just fate, it's choice. Every moment, every breath. Ara's chest ached with the sweetness of it. I don't know if I love you yet, she said honestly, but I think I'm starting to, and I want to see where it leads. That's enough, Veyron said. More than enough. They spent the rest of the day in quiet companionship. He cooked their final meal in the cabin while she packed the few things she'd brought. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, And when night fell, they sat together by the fire and talked about what came next. "The council will want a ceremony," Veyron said. "A proper one." "Can we do it here?" Ara asked. "Just us. No grand hall, no crowd." He smiled, warm and genuine. "I'd like that. And after—" She hesitated. "I want to keep this. The honesty. The quiet. Even when we go back." "We will," Veyron promised. "I'll bring you here as often as you need. This place is ours now. Our refuge." Ara leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and let herself believe it. Later, when the fire had burned to embers and the night pressed close around them, Veyron drew her to his bed, not with urgency or demand, but with gentle invitation. They came together slowly, with trust and tenderness, and Ara discovered that intimacy chosen felt nothing like the cage she'd feared. It felt like freedom, like flying and being caught at the same time. When dawn broke through the windows, painting everything gold, Ara woke wrapped in Veyron's arms. He stirred beside her, his eyes opening to find her already watching. "Good morning," he murmured. "Good morning." He smiled, and she saw her future written in that expression. Not perfect, not without fear or struggle, but honest, and chosen, and hers. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Ara looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, then back at the man who had given her the gift of choice. "Yes," she said, "let's go home."